There is a quality that almost every high-performing environment treats as essential: the belief that high expectations drive better outcomes, that ambition without ceiling produces results that measured ambition cannot reach, that the investor who expects more will, through that expectation alone, find ways to achieve more. This belief is so embedded in professional culture that questioning it feels almost contrarian. Expectations are framed as fuel, as the psychological engine that keeps effort directed and standards meaningfully high, as the internal standard that separates serious participants from casual ones. But markets have a way of exposing assumptions that work well in other environments and quietly fail in this one. In practice, high expectations do not simply reflect anticipated outcomes. They shape behavior in ways that are rarely examined with the honesty the subject deserves. And the behavior they shape is often precisely the behavior that undermines the outcomes being sought in the first place. This is not an argument against ambition or intellectual seriousness about financial goals. It is an observation about what expectations actually do inside a probabilistic environment where outcomes are distributed across time in ways that no expectation can fully anticipate or control. To understand why, it is worth examining how expectations function as internal benchmarks in practice. Every expectation establishes a reference point against which reality is continuously and largely unconsciously measured. When reality tracks the expectation, the psychological experience is neutral or quietly positive. When reality diverges from the expectation, even temporarily and within entirely normal parameters, the gap registers immediately as a problem requiring attention and response. The gap creates discomfort that feels meaningful and genuinely urgent. The discomfort creates pressure to act in ways that resolve the gap, rather than simply observe it with patience. The action taken to resolve the gap is rarely optimal, because it is driven by the psychological need to eliminate discomfort rather than by objective assessment of what the situation actually requires from an investment standpoint. This is the hidden mechanism that high expectations reliably produce inside market environments. The higher the expectation, the lower the tolerance for normal variation becomes. And markets are environments defined entirely by normal variation. Drawdowns are not aberrations in a healthy long-term portfolio. They are the expected and structurally necessary condition through which compounding operates across full market cycles. Periods of underperformance relative to a benchmark or a peer group are not evidence of a failing strategy or a mistaken approach. They are an inherent feature of every sound methodology that has a defined and consistent investment philosophy. But these realities offer limited psychological comfort to the investor, whose internal benchmark is being continuously violated by the widening gap between what was expected and what is currently observed in the portfolio. What appears from outside as disciplined strategy management is often, from the inside, simply an attempt to close that gap as efficiently and as quickly as possible. The discipline is genuine, but it is being deployed in service of expectation resolution rather than long-term value creation. And those two objectives are not always aligned, and in volatile markets they are frequently in direct tension with each other. The behavioral consequences of this are specific and consistent enough to be worth naming directly and examining honestly. The investor managing against a high internal expectation checks results more frequently than the information contained in those results can possibly justify acting upon. They respond to short-term performance as though it carries reliable information about the long-term validity of their approach, which it rarely does with any meaningful consistency. They abandon strategies during periods of underperformance that fall well within the normal distribution of outcomes for that strategy, simply because the underperformance violates an expectation that was established independently of what normal variation for that strategy actually looks like historically. They increase risk during periods when the portfolio has fallen behind an internal target, not because the risk environment has become more favourable or the opportunity set more attractive, but because catching up requires acceleration that conservative and patient positioning cannot provide on the timeline the expectation demands. None of these responses feel irrational in the moments they occur. Each one feels like a reasonable and carefully considered adjustment to a genuine problem that has been clearly identified through attentive monitoring. But the problem that has been identified is not a market problem or a fundamental portfolio problem. It is an expectation problem. The strategy is being managed against an internal benchmark that the market was never consulted about and has no structural obligation to respect on any particular timeline. When this dynamic operates across enough participants simultaneously, its consequences become visible in aggregate market behaviour in ways that affect everyone operating in the same environment. Performance chasing concentrates in the periods following strong returns, precisely when the probability of continuation is statistically lowest and the risk of mean reversion is most elevated. Selling concentrates in periods of underperformance, precisely when long-term value relative to current price is most likely to be genuinely favourable for the patient buyer. Portfolios are repositioned continuously, not because conditions have changed in ways that objectively require repositioning, but because the current positioning is producing a gap between expectation and observed outcome that feels psychologically unsustainable across consecutive reporting periods. Time horizons compress under the accumulated pressure of expectation gaps, because a longer time horizon requires tolerating a longer and more uncertain period of not knowing whether the gap will eventually close in the expected direction. And when time horizons compress across a significant portion of market participants simultaneously, the mathematical conditions for compounding deteriorate in ways that are structural rather than temporary. Expectations compress time. When time horizons shrink, compounding weakens at precisely the moment it most needs to be left undisturbed. The transfer of wealth that results is not from the less informed to the better informed. It is from the expectation pressured to the expectation flexible. From those whose behaviour is being driven by the gap to those who have structured their psychology so that the gap does not reliably produce behaviour. Here the dynamic becomes particularly worth examining through the lens of analytical sophistication and genuine intellectual capability. More capable investors do not typically hold vague or loosely defined expectations about their portfolios. They construct precise ones, detailed forecasts with specific return targets, defined timelines, quantified assumptions about the reasonable range of probable outcomes under various market conditions. The analysis behind these expectations is often genuinely rigorous and carefully stress-tested against historical data. But precision in expectation does not reduce the psychological problem of expectation gaps. It amplifies it considerably and in specific ways that are difficult to detect from the inside. A vague expectation of reasonable long-term returns can accommodate a wide range of short-term outcomes without registering a gap significant enough to trigger meaningful behavioural response. A precise expectation of a specific annualized return over a defined window creates a much narrower corridor of psychologically acceptable outcomes. Every period that falls outside that corridor produces a gap with a specific and measurable magnitude. Every gap of measurable magnitude produces proportionate pressure. Every pressure of sufficient magnitude produces the conditions for a decision that the underlying situation did not actually require. Intelligence improves the quality and coherence of the analysis used to construct the expectation. It does not improve the emotional tolerance for deviation from it once it has been established with conviction. In many cases, it actively reduces that tolerance because the expectation was constructed with enough analytical rigor that deviations feel like evidence of a genuine failure in the reasoning rather than the expression of normal probabilistic variation across time. The more precisely the expectation is defined, the more psychologically costly it becomes to simply observe deviation and remain patient and undisturbed. The analytical capability that produced the rigorous expectation creates a behavioral liability that operates quietly alongside every subsequent portfolio decision. The investors who avoid this liability over long periods are not distinguished by the absence of analytical capability or intellectual engagement with markets. They are distinguished by the deliberate looseness with which they hold their expectations relative to the discipline with which they hold their underlying process. The investor, with flexible or consciously modest expectations, tolerates volatility more easily because the volatility does not register as a significant or urgent gap requiring portfolio-level resolution. They make fewer unnecessary decisions because the threshold for what constitutes a genuine problem requiring action is set considerably higher than the threshold created by expectation pressure operating on a compressed timeline. They maintain longer time horizons because longer time horizons do not require tolerating the psychological experience of a growing and increasingly uncomfortable gap between what was expected by a certain date and what has actually arrived. They are not passive or disengaged participants who have abandoned serious thinking about their portfolios. They are simply operating with a different and considerably more forgiving internal benchmark against which short-term reality is measured. The compounding they allow to operate without interference is not the product of superior predictive insight into what markets will do across the next cycle. It is the product of reduced interference with what markets were already doing on their behalf across the cycle currently unfolding. Expectations feel, from the inside, like a driver of progress and a source of productive accountability toward financial goals. In most performance environments, that feeling is accurate enough to be genuinely useful. But markets are not most environments. They are probabilistic systems that distribute outcomes across time according to their own internal logic, without reference to the internal benchmarks of any of the people participating in them. The outcomes most investors are seeking are often already structurally available within the approach they have chosen and the time horizon they have nominally committed to. The strategy is sound and the conditions for compounding are genuinely present. What prevents those outcomes from arriving is not a shortage of opportunity or a fundamental failure of analysis. It is the pressure to accelerate them beyond the pace that the market and the chosen strategy are capable of delivering without the interference that acceleration requires. And that pressure, traced carefully back to its origin, almost always begins with the expectation that was set before a single position was entered or a single dollar was committed. The quieter advantage belongs to those who expect less from any given reporting period and ask more of time itself, who allow the process to operate across the full horizon it genuinely requires, rather than the compressed one that expectation pressure continuously and invisibly attempts to impose, who understand, at a level that actually shapes behavior rather than simply informing it, that time was already doing the necessary work. The only question was always whether patience would allow it to finish undisturbed.